In late December, protests erupted across Iran. Again. And this time, the regime's response was devastating.
So there's a breakdown in the state-society relation in this way that has led to these repeated rounds of protests. The regime always responded to them brutally by killing some people. But I have to say, in my worst nightmares, I couldn't have imagined the kind of killing that the regime did on January 8th and January 9th, killing thousands of people. It's just, you want these numbers to not be true.
It's a pattern that's been repeating for years. Iranians take to the streets, and the government meets them with force. But the cracks are widening. Iran's proxy networks have been decimated since October 7th. Its economy is strangled by sanctions. And Ali Khamenei, 86 years old, presides over a regime fractured by competing factions, preparing for what comes next.
I don't think even democracy is the priority for many Iranians. What they want is the regime to go and for them to have literally what they call a normal life. It's an actual slogan in Iran, by which they mean they want a situation in which they can make a living and they can have what most of us have as some sort of a normal life, and what the regime has made impossible.
Now, negotiations with the United States are on the table. But so is the possibility of military action. What does the Iranian public actually want? How might a deal, or the collapse of one, reshape the country? And is the Islamic Republic, as we know it, nearing its end?
It's quite possible that these negotiations won't lead to a deal and they will lead to attacks. It's quite possible that we'll have both diplomacy and attacks in the next little while.
This is Global Insights by Network 2020. Today, Iran at a turning point. Today, we're joined by Dr. Arash Azizi, Postdoctoral Associate and Lecturer at Yale University and contributing writer at The Atlantic, whose work focuses on Iranian history and political movements. Moderating the conversation is Courtney Doggart, President of Network 2020.
Would you mind just doing a brief scene setter, sort of where things are right now in terms of protest activities, state reclaiming control, U.S. pressure, and what's really important to understand about this moment, or what's often misunderstood?
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be back with you all. Iran is certainly at a turning point in its history, and we use these terms a lot, but this truly is a turning point. The Islamic Republic, as we know it, is not long for this world. There's always a lot of basic questions when protests begin. People, for example, ask, is the regime going to be overthrown? I wrote early on to the Sharjah of Many. I wrote it on January 1st, literally New Year's Eve. I was writing a piece instead of doing New Year's Eve. That it was unlikely for the regime to topple through demonstrations. And nevertheless, I wrote an article a few days later saying that the regime, the Islamic Republic, was not going to last. So here's the situation. The Islamic Republic has for long been defined by a couple of basic features. It tries to enforce some sort of an Islamist Puritan rule on the society where people have to abide by elaborate religious rules. And also it uses the country of Iran, a country of 90 million, as a launching pad for fighting a crusade against Israel and the United States. These are really the core features of the Islamic Republic. They haven't always been followed by everyone in the regime, but it's certainly a direction that Ayatollah Khamenei, supreme leader who is in charge since 1989 and who has beat a lot of his rivals over the years to maintain control, has done. Now, Anna Rodman mentioned Javad Zarif, a former foreign minister. People like Zarif tried to take Iran to a different direction. They still do, but they had failed in terms of being actually able to take hold of the Islamic Republic. Okay, so the result of this, the rule by the Islamic Republic and its basic features, has been really breakdown of a social contracts. My friend Karim Sajjadpour, I think saw recently in an article called it a predatory lease instead of a social contract. Look, to put it basically, Iranians not only don't want to live by the religious strictures of the regime and have to chafe under it, But the foreign policy has meant Iran is one of the most sanctioned countries in the world, that it also doesn't have its basic security. Every day it might be attacked by US or Israel. It's been attacked by 3 nuclear powers in the last couple of years. It fought a war, of course, last summer with the US and Israel that was very inconclusive. It has an open file, effectively, because its official ideology is that we need to destroy Israel. No other country in the world has an official ideology like that. There are many countries who don't like Israel. There are many countries who basically won't recognize Israel. But to say that we need to destroy Israel, it's sort of very special. I don't think there's any other country in the world who wants to destroy any other UN member nation. And that comes with consequences. And of course, death to America is something that is written on the banner of the regime, and it tries to achieve it. Okay, so Iranians have come out in repeated rounds of protests in 2017, 2019, 2022, 2023, and now in a new one. It started in 2025, December 29th, and it expanded to the new year. So why do Iranians, at the risk of their lives, come out time and time again? Because these policies of the regime are totally untenable. Not only people, as I said, were chafing under these strictures, religious strictures and all that, they now couldn't afford basic life. And it's not just that, okay, the country is poor. There are many countries in the world that are poor. So it's not just a matter of poor. It's that you think like there's an economic crisis, declining standard of living, impossibility to plan a future that has helped bring people out against the regime. So there's a breakdown in the state-society relation in this way that has led to these repeated rounds of protests. The regime always responded to them brutally by killing some people. But I have to say, in my worst nightmares, personally, I couldn't have imagined the kind of killing that the regime did on January 8th and January 9th, killing thousands of people everywhere. It's just simply hard to imagine and simply hard to analyze and simply hard to put. You want these numbers to not be true. You want to think this is not possible, but this is what they've done. Analytically, I knew it's possible, but emotionally and stuff, it's hard to actually sort of cope with. But anyways, this is what the regime has done. At the same time, it is surrounded by US militarily. US obviously has investments in the regime not continuing as it is, and with Israel. And it's on a clashing course with them. Of course, President Trump had promised to come to the aid of protesters. He didn't really do so. I always believe that he prefers to deal with the regime as it is. Okay, so let me just say where we are, and I think it's better to just enter, and then I don't want to speak too much. I want to see where you want me to go in depth. I'll go in more depth. But here's where we are. The regime there are 3 factors that will determine the next chapter. There is regime and its inside machination. That's very important. There are different military and financial factions inside the regime who they also understand this untenability of the protest. It's untenable because this is not governance. If you need to go out on the street and kill thousands of people every couple of years, this is no governance. And if you have an open conflict situation with your neighborhood, with Israel and with the United States, that's also not governance. So they understand this untenability and they want to do something about it. Different machinations inside the regime. Not one. 2, it's the people and the opposition groups to the degree that which they exist. They mostly don't exist. But I mean, Reza Pahlavi as a figure in the US is the son of the last Shah of Iran. And we can talk about him if you want, but so he's a major opposition figure, and some others abroad, but also people in Iran who've come out and will come out again, and they're part of the equation. That's 2, and 3 is in the United States and Israel. Interactions between these 3 will write the next chapter of Iranian history. Now, where are we with these 3 right now? The people are defiant. They're broken down and suppressed and sent home for now by massive killing, but they're defiant. They also, I think, understand what I understand, which is that the 2 other factors, machinations inside the regime and the US and them, are very important. So there's a bit of a desperation. They look to these people. And in fact, they even look to Mr. Pahlavi a little bit, who's in DC, and they think he can do something. So they're defiant, but they're not great subjecthood. They're not expressing great subjecthood. They feel like their destiny is not there in their own hands. That's people. The regime insiders operate under one important thing to remember, that first, Ayatollah Khamenei is 86, is going 87 in April. And while if you have family members who are that old, I wish them very long life. This is not true. The same is not true with Mr. Khamenei. We are hoping that he doesn't have a long to live after 87. And at any rate, he will die at some point. And this death it's very important, and we can talk about it. But basically, everything is likely to change after he's gone because there are not a lot of people who follow him. And the last thing I'd say, and then we can go to the other questions, is that the United States, of course, President Trump, I do consultancy sometimes in different places, and the gambit of a consultancy is basically you use your analysis so people can predict the future. President Trump has been terrible for this business of consultancy because, of course, he's hard to predict. But there's some negotiations that are going on with the regime now, and according to how they go, we might see military action. Mehdi said we've seen the first shot fired. That's certainly one way of looking at it. It's quite possible that these negotiations won't lead to a deal and they will lead to attacks. It's quite possible that we'll have both diplomacy and attacks in the next little while. But anyways, that's where we are. And if you ask me, I think the machinations inside the regime part is also very important, and that we are likely to. So I said Islamic Republic is not long for this world. I meant those core structures and core policies are untenable and they're likely to change. But the change is unlikely to come from below in terms of a people toppling the government by the protest, but from inside by machinations under the pressure from both people and foreign attacks. So I hope this is a good opening image, and then I'm happy to go where you want me to go.
It's a great overview. Thank you. So I'd like to talk about the people right now. I think my understanding is that there's just a lot of, widespread fear in Iran. There's the economic pressure, there's the trauma of arrests and all the deaths following the protests, uncertainty over what Trump is going to do. If you were to describe public attitudes today, what do they look like? And are there important divisions within Iranian society that are important to know about?
So public attitudes toward the regime, you mean, or?
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Toward the regime and toward the future in general.
Because you said why Iranians want from Trump. Yeah. So 85% of the people don't want the regime. And really, it's not hard to see why. This is a regime. It's almost a talent to offer so little to your people, right? I mean, this regime, if you live in like Vietnam, you might not like communism, the Communist Party title, and you might not like authoritarianism. But you say, okay, Vietnam is a good Vietnamese national government. It appears that it's supporting Vietnam's national interest versus China and others. There's economic growth, right? You name another country, right? You name literally most countries in the world. There's something that the regime is giving its people, right? But what is the Iranian regime? What has the Iranian regime given its people, right? Like, what do they have to live for? Anything that they have to live for is in spite of the regime, right? Not because of it. So 85% of the regime of the people are against the regime. There is a loyal minority, some of whom are very organized. And the reason they're organized is that they're invested in this. First of all, they have material interests sometimes because they're linked to this regime's bodies, but they're also invested in this idea of a regime as a launch pad for anti-Western revolution and all that. But that's a small minority. Now, in terms of what else, I think why Iranians want from Trump, look, I think many Iranians would like President Trump to come and save them, to somehow overthrow the regime, kill Khamenei, bring something new. Now, that's not how always things work. But I can tell you, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, even 3 years ago, foreign intervention would have been a much more controversial issue than it is now. I think people, after the regime kills thousands of them, they just want someone to come to their help. I'm not saying I'm advocating this. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying it would lead to good things. I'm just reflecting to you what is the mood on the Iranian street. Again, not hard to understand, like many felt under Assad in Syria. They like a Superman to come help them. President Trump acts like a Superman. Like, he says, I'm going to come help you. I'm going to come save you. So if you think you have that option, why not? And Reza Pahlavi, who has many supporters in Iran, he doesn't have majority support. As I said, we can talk about him if you want separately. So since you mentioned what do people want, I can say Mr. Pahlavi, he has many problems. He's been a divisive figure, not a uniting figure of the Iranian opposition. But he does have many supporters in Iran. And he has been promising effectively that he'll bring help from President Trump. So many Iranians follow on that. But what do most Iranians want? They want this regime to go, and they want some of us want democracy, and that's a priority for us. But frankly, I don't think even democracy is a priority for many Iranians. What they want is the regime to go and for them to have literally what they call a normal life, an actual slogan in Iran, by which they mean they want a situation in which they can make a living and they can have what most of us have as some sort of a normal life, and what the regime has made impossible. So that's where they are.
So then just to dig into a little bit more on the other side of things about what they might want from Trump, what does that look like? Is there a feeling about what the U.S. can do that would be on the scale of this is an ideal scenario to remove the regime and keep things as somewhat stable as possible without opening a Pandora's box? Or are people just wanting any sort of change? What do they want from Trump?
As I said, most people look at the world and sometimes they don't have fully formed ideas and stuff. I mean, they want Trump to kill Khamenei if he can. Like, they literally want him to take Khamenei out, decapacitate, because it sounds like simple enough. Of course, it's not quite simple, but it is simple, actually. It's just a matter of whether you have the intelligence or not to do it. And they think if you kill Khamenei, other things will follow. And they want Trump to help them get rid of the regime. Some of them think maybe Trump can get rid of the regime and they can sort of foster in the transition. But, I mean, people don't think it through. They just want help versus these guys. There are many who are apprehensive of this, who are worried about what will happen, who are worried about Iran going to a civil war scenario like Iraq and Libya and Syria and many other bad examples of foreign intervention. But many others are basically, excuse my French, they're like saying F it, whatever. Like, we need to get rid of these guys by any means necessary. So if you ask me about the mood, I mean, that's the sort of mood that many have. Now, for those who are analysts and others, like, let me tell you, people who have advocated for foreign intervention now include Shirin Ebadi, who is a Nobel Peace Laureate. And in the article that I wrote in The Atlantic, I interviewed some of the people to say, okay, what do you mean when you want foreign intervention? And what you hear most of the time is, we want Trump to take out Khamenei. But now, let me tell you something else, which is that, okay, also many people in the Iranian domestic opposition, they don't want that. They think, look, foreign intervention is bad. It will lead to bad things, so we are opposing it and all that. Now, how about the talks? Now, what is going to come out of these talks, right? Here's the talks that are scheduled for Friday in Istanbul. They might move to Oman or Doha, or today is Tuesday. Many things can change until we hit Friday. Many things, everything can change, including there can be attacks and all that. What do people want out of the talks? I'll just tell you, for example, that Arjomand, who is the advisor to Mir Hossein Mousavi, who was the former foreign minister, who is now also a major opposition leader. He's in house arrest in Tehran. He was the candidate who, in 2009, contested the election results. He was put in house arrest in 2011, has a lot of supporters, traditionally very apprehensive of foreign intervention. So Arjomand has spoken in favor of the talks. He said, if Iran goes away from the war, and these negotiations can lead to a good thing. But the real question about the talks is, what can President Trump gain? What concessions can he gain that will actually better the life of people in Iran, that would lead to something positive for Iranians? And I guess the basic classic worry is, what if he gets them to shelve the nuclear issue, which is what the world really cares about, and the regime is strengthened, but obviously it's in power, it doesn't do anything else for its people, and effectively would be seen as Trump giving it a lifeline over the nuclear issue. And the president can always declare victory, like he doesn't depend on the facts. He can always just say, oh no, I got the best deal possible, Obama could never do this, I did it, I'm the best ever, this sort of thing. So I think that's what some people are worried about. But realistically also, it is possible that he's able to gain enough concessions that the regime will effectively go on the path of an internal transformation and change as we know it. I have to say that this has long been my prognosis, and I pointed out today, that the change will come from inside the regime. And it will be some sort of it could be you wait Khamenei to die and then you change everything. It could be that you even sideline Khamenei. But I do believe that the regime will have to change its policy. So when I said the Islamic Republic will not last, which as Brian Conley shared as the title of this article, that's what I mean. That its core structures and its core policies were not long for this world.
I'd love to just dig into the government piece a little bit. I feel that those who have been following around for a while, a decade or so ago, I think there was always this feeling that Iran was sort of like two governments, right? You had the clerics, the Revolutionary Guard, and then you sort of had this maybe reforming class that was governing. And so it was sort of this two systems that were able to kind of coexist. It almost feels as though the maybe more reformist side has just been subsumed into this. Is that correct? And then related to that, where does leadership go, especially now that it's 45 years since the revolution? This is a second generation of leaders coming up, and where are their attitudes at? And what kind of prognosis would you give based on this next generation?
Yeah, so Iran indeed has a state, and it's not about, sometimes it's led, by the state, I mean, there's a part of the government led by the president. The president has sometimes been a reformist, sometimes not, right? So Ahmadinejad and Raisi were hardliners. Khatami was a reformist. Pezeshkian is a reformist. So it's not that the state is sometimes controlled by reformists, sometimes not. But then there's always been a massive shadow state, that is the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, all these what we call the parastatal foundations. It's a fancy term we have for this foundations that are somehow public, but they're really run by as private fiefdoms by different people. And they overpower the actual government. To the degree that today, President of Iran, President Pezeshkian, is not an important figure. I mean, he is not one of the most powerful men in Iran, right? So he's the president, but really he doesn't rule the roost. And nor does Khamenei, the supreme leader, alone anymore. But what effectively as Iranian economy, and it's not just the government, the Iranian economy and governance structures are effectively 4 or 5 interlocking mafia type structures that duke it out with each other and that run things. And they're kind of waiting for Khamenei to die to prepare for the next step, as I said. So, and Pezeshkian and them they control the actual government. But actually, there is Khamenei, since the last year's war, that the 12-day war, has been rather sidelined in some ways. He still is sort of the top guy, but he doesn't have endless authority anymore. They really did at a point. And now you have sort of a collective decision-making in the regime. So the whole reformist versus hardliner stuff don't matter as much, because the collective decision-making is really made through National Security Council, Supreme National Security Council, which is headed by the president, Pezeshkian, but he is just sort of a convener of it. The real power in it lies with all the military commanders who are in there. There's like a dozen people, the cabinet ministers, most of them commanders from both the IRGC and the Artesh, the Iran's national army, and the national security advisor, Ali Larijani, who is an important figure. And he also plays kind of a convener role in the National Security Council. And there are several sort of powerful figures, people like Ali Shamkhani, who is, his job is Khamenei's representative on the Defense Council, which Defense Council is kind of was revamped last year. It was made for the first time last year, kind of underneath the National Security Council. Okay, so this is where power is, by this sort of different factions. Now, the future generation. Look, Khamenei said in 2019, in the 40th anniversary of the revolution, that the power needs to pass to what he called revolutionary devout youth, that the regime needs to train a new cadre, new generation to continue these hardline policies. He failed. They exist, but they're a bunch of losers. You know, they're sort of talking shops, people with like podcast talking heads with PhDs, like we might have a few around here, present, including myself, but not effective power players in a mafia type of state like Iran. So these guys are not you have people like Sabeti in the Iranian parliament, MP. Yesterday, he called for preemptive attacks on America. Great to give his speeches, great on podcasts, not someone who is able to run the world or run Iran. So the real power rests with some of the old guard, people like Larijani, people like Shamkhani, who control different military and financial bodies. And they have some of the younger ones, but they're very interest-based, after the privileges of themselves and their own family, not ideological, and bent on positively transforming the regime. So I hope that's sort of a clear answer, right? This is why I have the prognosis that I do in terms of change coming from within. I think the untenability of these core policies are. And okay, so what does it actually mean, right? So here's what it means. What it actually means is one thing that could happen is either Khamenei dies, or in the negotiations, Witkoff and Kushner convince these guys to push Khamenei away and stuff. But what does the next iteration look like? The next iteration look like a new group of sort of military and financial elites come to power. They make a deal with the United States and Israel. The sanctions that start getting lifted. They're not going to enforce the religious strictures. So they basically try to make things a little better. People's lives start getting a little better. The domestic pressure on the regime will be less. Foreign pressure will be less. They'll be able to transition to a new status quo in Iran, which will be authoritarian, but a bit more normal, a bit more like Pakistan or stuff. Pakistan, Algeria. But it's also possible, of course, that this new group will go on a new sort of belligerent attitude, and actually Khamenei would, in this version of scenario, Khamenei would be seen as someone who was too recalcitrant, too reluctant to act, too cowardly, frankly. And they would say they would need the missiles, they would develop them further, they'll take the fight, they'll try to fight, and they'll try to sort of have a more militant Iran that is able to defend its corner and rebuild itself in that way. So, I mean, that would also be a post-Khamenei Iran, but of a different color. And they might even they might also have the social relaxation of social repression, but added with this military sort of militant attitude abroad. But the question then is that can they improve things economically? Because if you cannot improve things economically in Iran, you're lost before it begins. I hope this gives a clear image.
Yeah. Well, that would really require, I suppose, the lifting of the sanctions. And so that's where I guess the negotiations get really interesting. I'll just try to get in maybe one more question and then open it up to the group. What are some of the biggest mistakes or concerns you have about mistakes on the part of U.S. policymakers in this fairly tense moment?
Sorry, would you repeat that 1 second? I lost you.
Just what are some of the concerns that you have about mistakes that U.S. policymakers might make in this tense moment right now?
That's a very good question. Well, I would say a few things. First of all, not considering the grave consequences of a state collapse in Iran. Like, if you're thinking, what happens if you have a state collapse, you have civil war, where does this go? Not caring, frankly. And B, would be thinking that a long-term war or sort of a expanded war in the region is impossible. It's not impossible. It's thinking that Iran is always bluffing, and it is possible that you get into a situation you cannot manage and nothing good comes out of it. And partially related to the A point, like civil war. I mean, that's one of the worst case scenarios. These are two of the main ones I can think of. I guess the other one is, Islamic Republic for so long Iran policy has always been such a generative debate because it's so hard and because it's the challenge between treating Islamic Republic as an immediate problem and thinking about how to deal with it in sort of an eventual way has always been there. If you stop its nuclear program, how is it going to change later and all that? And I'll say that, so it's easy to sit down here and say, oh, well, they should find the fundamental solution and stuff. But perhaps there's actually something to say against visionary kind of foreign policy, right? I've made this argument before, actually look at someone like George Bush Sr., usually seen as a very successful foreign policy president. He famously said, I don't do the vision thing, right? And if you look at his time in office, it's incredible, actually, how he dealt with the crises as they occurred, right? In 1989, the fall of the Soviet Union, the Tiananmen in China, right? And try to do best actions at every given point. But I don't know what is the less Bush-like president that we could have than the one we currently have. Nevertheless, I'm not super pessimistic about it, actually, with all the problems we might have with this president. His ability to think outside the box in these issues, his good relations with, I have to say, if there's one positive point, is his good relations with the regional countries, i.e. with Turkey, with Saudi Arabia and others, means that he won't just listen to Israel, frankly, as many administrations have, and would also take these regional countries' interest in mind. So I would say I'll end by saying perhaps another big mistake would be to not take the aspirations of these regional countries in mind. Now, if you ask the average Iranian person on the street, they will say it would be a mistake if you trust these guys, and what you should really do is push them away and give the power back to us. But I mean, I don't know what that means, unfortunately, in the real world. I know that it's not so simple If the United States government wanted to help Iranian opposition get its act together, get united, and build an alternative to the regime, I think that would be great. I think it should have done it before. I think it would be good to try to do it now, but I just don't see the president being interested in that really, unless the negotiations go somewhere or the war goes somewhere, and then there's a need to fill the vacuum. In this case, they should try to bring about a democratic transition, not anoint someone as a leader or something.
Right. Thank you very much. On that note.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Global Insights. You can subscribe to Global Insights on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your audio. For more analysis, events, and ways to connect with our community, click on the link in the description. See you next time.